Thank you, Aleko. Thank you, Tom. Before this morning's session, which I thought, just like most of you, had to be a very fantastic session with a lot of insights, I thought I had an impossible task in my presentation now. Now I'm even more convinced that I have an impossible task in what I'm going to do. So what I'm going to do, okay, I'm going to give you a brief introduction, and then I'm going to go through a couple of slides which summarize a report that we have prepared. And the report is available for all of you, obviously. And then I'm going to identify some of the issues which I've not yet done in the report, which, I mean, I think challenges for the Foodsecure, for the future conceptual issues, right? Now, I know all of you know that you can only build a good model to analyze things and to predict things if you got the causal mechanisms right. So for that reason, to get the causality straight and the mechanisms clear, that's why you need this conceptual framework. Okay? Now, in a few minutes, I have to explain how this all fits together, right? I'm going to try to keep it simple, but at the same time, my main simple message is going to be, it's very complex. Okay? And if you have listened to the presentations this morning, okay, I think the main thing which came out, I mean, Aleko asked what's the common theme, okay, and there was not that much of a common theme. There were a couple of things, but there were a lot of differences between these regions, okay? And I think that's extremely important to keep in mind when we're going forward in this thing. It also poses a lot of challenges, I think, from the modeling perspective, okay? If there's so much diversity between the regions and the countries, okay, how the hell are you going to capture that when you're going to build the model? In the paper, and the paper is called The Conceptual Framework for the Analysis of the Determinants of Food and Nutrition Security. It's authored by 3 people from my institute, and Hannah, who's sitting right here, is the lead author. It's been reviewed by several of you, including, we got lots of comments from the review team as well. And it actually presents, I think, a nice perspective. It basically identifies the global, the national, the regional, the household level determinants, and the different policies. And so I've put in this presentation just the, said that already, this is a picture, we saw that, just a couple of the slides, and these are actually graphs taken from the report, which kind of summarize the text in the report, if you want, okay? So already Willis this morning talked about the left part of this, about food availability, food access and food utilization. In the report we talk in addition to that to vulnerability and resilience. We use definitions which have been developed and basically discuss the interactions between them. Now I think it's important for the work we've done, and I know all of you know this because you're specialists in the field, we have tried not to reinvent the wheel. A lot of things have been done by institutions like FAO, IFPRI, etc., and various research institutes. And we have drawn on that. We're also very happy that a lot of these experts are actually in our consortium and have been giving us comments, and we've worked with them. This is to take it a bit further. Here we look at the individual and the household level in terms of the determinants and the drivers, and you see it gets this arrows all over the place, and we really try to be basically try to keep it under control, because otherwise it would be even much more. So there's things like household resources, education, access to SIM, etc., risk coping strategies, etc. Then if you bring in policies, so we've identified 7 different groups of policies, and you see these little, so there's things like growth policies, health policies, education, and they start affecting all kinds of things around here. And this is what we've called micro-level policies, which is kind of it's a subjective, I would say, there's not clearly an objective definition of classification for that. Then when you bring the national and the global in, here we have long-term food effects, short-term food effects, and a whole bunch of things which are affecting each other. I mean, essentially I need 20 minutes for explanation one of these arrows, of course, you understand that. And then we link the macro-level policies to the individual and the household level. It gets even more complicated. We've got like 18 different policies identified now, which play a role in all these various things. And so what we've tried to do in the report is basically review the literature and identify what various studies have said on all these sub-effects. Okay? Now, what is important, I think, in the framework of this presentation and in this project is that this is very much work in progress. Some of the comments we got from the review committee, which is actually very correct comments, is that, well, this is what we knew already, okay? Which is true. I mean, it's kind of a stock-taking event that we've started with, And now I think the issue is almost all the different subgroups or the sub-working packages are to some extent developing this conceptual framework as we go about, and the idea is also to build on that, to integrate these things into a later report. Okay? I'm just going to, in the few minutes I have left, I'm going to just add a few, this is very subjective, a few key elements, key challenges I think for our work in this thing. And I think one of the issues is we've got to deal with is what are the key mechanisms and size of the effect? Meaning, I mean, we've got all kinds of arrows going. It's kind of a spaghetti ball type of thing, okay? But of course, some are more important than others. And so that's important from a policy perspective. What's the key policies we should look at? There is what can we change actually, or what do the people who are actually funding this thing want us to say something about their policy? Then another important thing is that some of the literature, when you review these gaps, that's obvious things we haven't looked at much in the past. I think Johan this morning already said a lot of it has been done on some aspect, but the nutrition issue has been much less researched. I mean, that's clearly one of them. I've identified the role of value chains here, how to integrate as in these models, political economy, climate change. And then I think a fourth element here, or fourth category, is there are things we think we know, but maybe we have to reconsider these, or basically, or reevaluate these, or check ourselves, because we got much better data sets, I think, than we had 10, 15 years ago. And of course, the scientific requirements have changed. There was Stefan der Kon, who is the professor in Oxford. He's now the head of DFID, or the chief economist at DFID. He gave a talk last year, and he said, you know, most of our paradigms that we're using in this framework are based on papers which would no longer be accepted in scientific journals these days. Okay? So that's something to think about. So we have to go back and see if all these paradigms are actually still as solid as we are with the new scientific developments that we have. I think maybe one thing why we're also, one element also, if you look, we're in a different world. We're in a different world for a number of reasons. Okay, a number have been mentioned already this morning. But also, I think we're in a different world if you think of the regulatory issues. Probably agriculture and food markets have never been so free in terms of less government intervention than they have been in maybe the past 100 years or something. Okay, because there's a lot of deregulation which has taken place both in developing countries and in rich countries. And this, of course, is something which really is a major factor when we start looking at all these things. Let me just identify a couple of these points and make them a bit more specific. In terms of the key mechanisms, what's the relative importance of the arrows? If we do, I mean, Hannah and I have worked on some simple regression analysis, and essentially it's quite amazing. You know, when this is cross-section type of analysis and over time, I mean, pooled data, and essentially when you do the regression analysis, 60–70% of the correlations with income, and all the rest it's hardly observable. Okay. So I just put some regressions here. You see this is simple correlation, this is stunting over a lot of countries, a lot of years, and essentially 63%, and if you add water, sanitation, other kind of thing, it just doesn't change much. Okay? Obviously this is correlation, but still, and we've done this on a number of other things, and the story is very much the same. Okay? Once you put in income, all the rest is kind of very marginal in terms of things. Now, one conclusion is, of course, well, this is not very good analysis in terms of identifying problems, because we know also from the presentations this morning that policies do work, okay, that investments do work. But the question is, of course, okay, if you think about identifying these effects and then using them to basically give advice to other countries or other regions, you have to be careful, because maybe it worked in this specific environment, but not necessarily in other environments, because otherwise it would show up here. Okay. So I think it's it's important to look at these, combine these qualitative analyses, but it's also important to be careful in terms of drawing conclusions from them. Value chains, this is something which has not been looked at in the traditional literature very much. Our own research over the past 10–15 years has shown that it can be an important mechanism in basically improving food security by two channels, okay, two mechanisms. One is transferring technology, know-how and capital inputs to poor farmers, and by reducing food gaps, basically because they have a different source of income which they can use basically to buy food in periods that they can't produce it themselves. That's both of these mechanisms. And we have several case studies, I just list 3 here, where we find both of these effects working and being very important for very poor people. Okay? Now, how do you build this thing into some model exercise? It's very difficult, I think. Okay? But it's certainly something which is is already important and is going to be more important in the future. Now, in terms of key policies, so this is taken from the project description. So a key focus of the project should be the identification of critical pathways for EU policies, okay, because that's EU funding, in the area of development aid, climate change, trade, common agricultural policy, and renewable energy. I'm going to split them up in 2. I'm not going to talk about climate change, because I don't know very much about that. Let's think about trade, agricultural policy, and renewable energy, and particularly the biofuel thing, right? This effect, okay, works not exclusively, there's all kinds of other things, but one of the biggest effects is through prices, okay? So what do we know about these prices effects, okay? Are high food prices good or bad for global food security? So before 2007, the common wisdom was they're good for global food security. I can give you lots of citations on that. Since 2007, the common wisdom is they're bad. And now it seems to be switching back again a bit. If you look at the initial estimates, this is just a quote, about 75 to 160 million people were thrown into hunger or poverty because of the price spikes. I think there's micro evidence now, which is increasingly coming out, various studies, which show very heterogeneous effect, which is quite different actually. And there's a new study from Will Martin and Marcos Ivanic, and who basically calculated these 105 million actually. They find that when they include rural wage elasticities, which are positive, then okay, these poverty effects really change quite dramatically. Okay? And there's a very nice study just out by Hanan Jacobi from the World Bank. He shows that in rural India, essentially high food prices are actually good for the very poor, even if they are net sellers of food, because of the very strong wage elasticities that they find. Okay? Now these are extremely important to build, to get right, because they are essentially going to determine, when you run the models, whether essentially biofuels, the common agricultural policy reform, or trade liberalization is good or bad for the poor. Because it's these elasticities we're going to drive her outcome. Okay. My last point is about, how much minutes do I have on that?
We have another 3 or 4 minutes.
Okay, it's about food aid and development aid. Food aid, I'm just going to say something, they're both linked to my arguments here are linked to political economy arguments, okay? This is data from international food aid by the European Union. And you see this starts from 91 to 2011, essentially the last 20 years. And you can clearly see this is the total here, and there's a straight line down. Okay? And the most important factor behind that is the reform of the European agricultural policy, because we had a very interventionist system over here where we had surplus production, etc. And because of that, essentially, we have reformed this. We've gone to a system where we subsidize farmers' income and no longer basically the prices, and as a result, we don't have stocks anymore, no more surpluses. Okay? And as a result, food aid in kind has declined quite dramatically over time. Then my last point is going to be about the food prices and the political economy of aid, and this is based on some very recent work that we've done, and this is a bit to challenge our thinking. Okay, let's go back, let's all try to go back to 2004. Okay? So we're in 2004. Remember what you were doing then and thinking about the world. This is how the world looked like according to key indicators. 27% of the world was poor according to the 1.25 dollar per capita indicator. 14% was malnourished according to the FAO indicator. And those are essentially 70% of them are people or households whose main source of income is agriculture. Okay? So they're 50% smallholder farmers, 20% landless rural workers in there. Now, the world doesn't really care. And why do I say that? Well, when you look in the media in those days, when you look at the priority agenda on policymakers, basically people don't care very much about agriculture, okay, poor farmers in developing countries. This is an indicator from, this is the agricultural development aid, which is really the share of total overseas development aid, which is going to agriculture from 96 to 2007. And you see it's just going down, and it's going down very dramatically, from over 10% to less than 4% in essentially a period of 10 years. This is just an indicator from FAO as a percentage of the UN agencies. As it's a bit different, but it gives exactly the same indicator. Okay? Now, let's fast forward 5 years from 2005. We're in 2010, 11, 12 now. So this has happened to poverty and undernourishment. So this is the poverty, which has continued to go down. So this is 2011 here. And this is malnutrition according to the recent FAO data, which has also continued to go down. Now, so in this way, the situation has improved. 20% is poor instead of 27. 12% is malnourished instead of 14. So, and basically, but I mean, smallholder farmers, landless, rural people are still the vast majority of the very poor and hungry people. And of course, every single one of these 12% and 20% is one too much. Okay, we all agree on that. But what's very interesting, okay, is that despite the fact that the situation has improved, that the way the Western world and a lot of the international world looks, or development world looks at it, has changed dramatically. Okay, poverty and food security is all over the mass media. It's high on policymakers' agenda. I could give you like hundreds of copies from newspapers. I'm going fast here because I just want to get to it. This is from 2012, okay, where the head of the European Commission, President Barroso, meets with the FAO Director General to join forces to fight hunger. There's no such picture before 2007. Okay? And so, why is, okay, and then funding, look at the funding numbers. It's just a dramatic turnaround, both if you look at the FAO story here, or in the agricultural development sector. Okay? And so, why is that? Well, this reason, okay? It all comes, it's basically, you can all feel it, or you know it, you've been in the debate. And so this is actually quite remarkable, and I'm going to use a couple of other illustrations. I'll come back to the political economy effect because I don't have time to explain it in detail here. But we have correlated essentially media attention to agricultural development problems, poverty issues, food security with the food price. And what you see is the correlation is 83% over time. So this is the correlation here, if you put it down. And so the red line, that's the food price. Okay? And the spikes look quite small compared to the spikes in media attention. Okay? And you see they're much bigger, they go up fast, they come down faster. Okay, and that's the outlier stick. And so from that reason, and this is a political economy argument, the volatility actually really does play a role in basically bringing the issue on the policy agenda. Sorry, this is on the media agenda, and I got the same story, and this is on the policy agenda. We used an indicator here of how important agricultural development, rural poverty, food security was for the development committee of the IMF and the World Bank. And this is this indicator, okay? And this is the food price index. Okay? Again, the correlation is 80-something%, right? But again, the volatility is huge in terms of policy priorities. Yeah, I'm done. So I got some data to illustrate these things. But, so let me make my last point. So it seems to be, from a political economy perspective, right, that there is what I call an urban bias in global food security policy, if you want. But the urban bias story comes back from the old, I think it was Michael Lipton who made the point that essentially in the past when farmers were taxed in developing countries, that was because the urban consumers were better politically organized, had more impact on the government, and therefore that resulted in taxation of the poor farmers and basically low food prices for the consumers. What we have now is, I think, a bit of a different effect, because what happened is that there is an urban bias, again, I think that's what I found, the political economy story there, but the result is now very different in a way. It puts basically the problems of poor farmers on the agenda. It may actually help them. So that effect is very different from in the poor. And so I argue that modern global media have played an important role there. As I said, it's work in progress.
Thank you very much, Johan.
Good morning, everyone. So my presentation will be mainly to give you a quick summary of two of the working papers available on the Foodsecure website that gather the key elements of what we can call a conceptual framework for the short-term and the long-term analysis in the project. So I'm going to start with some general comments, then I will try to be more specific on the short-term aspect than on the long-term ones, and then I will give some conclusion about potentially the link between the two that is right now still a little missing in what we are doing in the project, but of maybe of important interest. So, sorry. I'm not going to go back to this general concept that have been discussed before, and I hope that we are all familiar about that. What are the different drivers between this food and nutrition security? In the recent weeks, I even have difficulty to understand why we talk about food and nutrition security. At the end, it's only nutrition security that really matters for humans, you know. The food is just an intermediate target. But still, we call about this food and nutrition security. And we have issues about availability, accessibility, utilization. So of course, some economic drivers are going to be much more preeminent, in particular in terms of accessibility, when we have knowledge, education, but also cultural aspects in utilization. And even if our projects try to look at the different angles of this FNS, we also have to be honest that we have a strong representation of economists and economic models within the teams involved, and this is why also we put more focus on the economic drivers, even if the economic driver are just a part of the whole story. Just because I would say that maybe my first approach on this issue is that all of this can be summarized between income and prices, and behind prices you have a lot of drivers. And how we can match this, in particular on prices, with short-term versus long-term type of analysis we have here. So I think that, and if I remember, it's a kind of typology that is quoted based on work from Joachim. But you can see in these prices, these three kind of components related to food and nutrition security. So you have the trend on prices, and typically this will be the long-term driver. So I will have it in my second part of the presentation. You have the price volatility that I think that we can associate to a short-term concept, but it's going to enter as a short-term driver and a long-term driver of food and nutrition security. It's not just a short-term issue. It's going to have long-term consequences. But it's a short-term concept. But for me, it's a short and long-term driver. And then there is these price spikes that are really a short-term concept and a short-term driver of some crisis. So if we try to focus on the short term, and so it's the deliverable 15, the working paper 15 of the project, in this output you will see a very interesting discussion of different issues. First, what is the best indicator for FNS? What are the drivers? What is the literature about it? And I will cover a very few aspects of this. But we have also to really think about some short-term mechanics, as I will call them. What is the link between price and volatility? What are the key drivers of short-term food security? Is it the evolution of price? And in this case, it's important to understand how price and volatility interact. Or is it volatility? That's not exactly the same thing. And in the different papers that are quoted, we see sometimes this ambiguity, okay? Is it the problem volatility? Is it the problem prices? And volatility is linked to phase of high prices or not? So I think that's a very important point to study and clarify. And when I was saying about the effect of volatility on the short run, we have to understand how volatility changes the behavior of some key agents in the short run, particularly about producers, traders, storage strategy. Because this is short-term consequences in terms of, do I am going to release my production on the market now or not? if I am in an episode of high volatility, I may just want. So it's a matter of expectation from the producer side. But 2 weeks of high volatility will not change your planting strategy. Okay? So we have to discriminate how short-term volatility and high volatility episode affect different agents on the producer side. On the consumption side, it's about the instability of some food practices. I think that's very important. And once again, we know that, for example, it's important for pregnant women to have a stable source of iron and things like this for the health of the baby. So do we face food consumption pattern very unstable or not? That may be another part. The role of policies, and in some cases, we have some countries that have very stochastic policymakers. So that's a source of instability in itself. In some cases, because they try to react to bad triggers. In some cases, they are just very random. Okay? If you see some policies for even key exporters like Ukraine, during 1 year, they are going to move from food export restriction to export subsidy. And it's not directly related to prices on one market. So there's a lot of political economy within countries that leads to this. And for business people, that can be a source of problem. Same thing when you have public storage. When the government is going to release the commodity on the market or not, you will see people not acting because they don't know when the government will act. And the key, I think, aspect of the deliverable is that really, for the short-term story on FNS, people are going to focus on price spikes. It's no more about price volatility, it's really price spikes. Because they may have a direct effect on consumption. And I will show you the conceptual framework after, but I think it's the key drivers, you know. It's not so much about volatility here, but really price spikes, consequent for consumers. My last comment, it's important one, is we have to keep in mind that in many cases we think about how markets are going to carry information, carry prices, but we have also a lot of events that just mean the end of market. When you have some natural disaster, when you have some war, markets stop to be operational. So in this case, the food and nutrition security on the short term is a very different story. In some of the things I'm going to show you, it's still when markets operate. Okay? There's not so much to discuss about prices and price volatility when basically you have a war, when people cannot carry goods, when people doesn't trust the currency anymore, and so on. So we have to be careful about these extreme events that can be very important in terms of food and nutrition security on the short term, but will require different things. On the short term also you will see the question of what is related short term. And are we thinking about daily, weekly, monthly? But obviously, once again, the time horizons, we are not looking at the same agents. Producers will not planify things on daily volatility. If you think about financial market, that's a different story. And if you think about the consumer, then you have to be careful. And then also this price transmission over space, from global to domestic market, regional markets, but also over time, with the value chain. Are we talking about processed goods? Are they distributed by supermarkets? Because then the price transmission is totally different. A staple food like rice, you can have a shock on world markets, and you will have a shock in Lagos, and people are directly affected by it. Now, if you are thinking about rice pudding sold by Yoplait in the European Union, but you will see 3, 4, 5 months before the price spike on the world market leads to a small price change for the consumers. So we are talking here about global food security, very different markets, very different people are affected very differently. So that's a conceptual framework for food and nutrition security as presented in the work paper number 15. And you see that really one of the key drivers here will be these price spikes and how it's going to affect basically the consumption and at the end key medical indicators. Another part of the paper and of interest for everyone is also how we measure at the end this food and nutrition security. What should be the indicators? And one of the conclusions of the paper is more to focus on the medical and anthropometric indicators, but it also means exactly in terms of time lag, in terms of frequency of the data, what we can do with this short-term aspect. Once again. And in the paper, you will see some preliminary investigation trying to, and this is a basic model, explaining that food and nutrition security is going to be a change of, explained by the change of prices or the volatility of prices, a key control variable for different things, and the previous, the lag variable of the nutrition and security indicators. And then the end of the paper is aimed to discuss what can be the policy response for this short-term aspect. Is it reducing volatility? But once again, if you say that volatility is not really the problem, but more a shortage of consumption in some case, is more to coping with volatility and basically coping with these price spikes. So really that's the type of discussion we have on the short-run aspect. For the long-term focus, here we propose a kind of more generic model where we are going to say that, of course, in the long run, food and nutrition security is a matter of quality and quantity. That's very something that works at the household and the individual level. Okay, so this is why basically we are talking about the consumption intake by an individual and it will depend basically of the share of the food expenditure he has access within the household, the income of the household, the prices faced by the household, and the preference he has. Okay, and all of this is within household and at individual level. And in many cases, for the modeling aspect of the project, that will be challenging, okay, because we don't have so much information and model operating at the individual level. When we reach the household level, we are already at it. And then you have aspect on the quality. Once again, the quality will depend on many things, including sanitary condition of the household and the whole quality of the food system. So for an agent, two key economic drivers are income and prices. And the prices he faced at the household level. Normally all people within the household will face the same prices. Will become about the world price, exchange rates, and basically access cost that can be on one hand at the macro level like a tariff, so price distortion at the macro level, but also access cost at the household level. Depending if you are once again in Lagos or in Abuja, you will not pay the same price for the rice. But this world price to some extent is the result of a market equilibrium between food supply and food demand, and both will have very different drivers that we can, we all basically know about them. For the food demand, it's going to be population, income distribution, preferences, quality of the food system, and also all the distortion we can think about. And for the food supply, is what is the amount of land we devote to food compared to non-food use, the yield, and also the efficiency of the system and the degree of waste that we have. And within this equation, you have a lot of drivers explaining how the yield is going to be involved. And once again, we are going to see prices, stability of prices, land quality, inputs, no land investment. And so all of this give you basically the big framework. But once again, in some cases, you see that in terms of yield or land allocated for food, what is important is the farm prices. So then we have to understand also all the distortion between farm prices, consumer prices, and so on. Just very snapshot, so the key drivers there are economic growth, structural evolution of consumption, all the agricultural factor markets, and we have seen in the previous presentation this morning also all the land structure matters. So it's not about just the amount of land, but also how it's organized. Technology, so about availability, adoption, but also legislation, and climate change, but just another type of technological shock to some extent. So what we also try to make clear in the papers, and just is mimicked by the equation I have shown you, is that you have a series of drivers that are really can be defined at individual or household level. So again, income, prices, and prices for food and non-food. I think it's very important to not forget about it, because what matters is your real income. So how the other bundle of your consumption, the other bundle of goods matter and services. If you don't pay for education and your health, you can afford to spend more money on your food. And when price of food go up, you are not going to reduce your consumption of health services. Now, if you have to pay for two, that's quite different. And after, you have really drivers that affect the market equilibrium with all the macro things we are used to. And some of them, like the capital markets and the liquidity markets at the country level, may not be thought, thank you, in many cases. But once again, when you have current account constraints for some country, how the exchange rate markets, how the global capital markets work is important. It's not a constraint that you face at an individual level, but it will affect basically the market equilibrium. Looking maybe at similar but also different data, we have the main conclusion that Joe has said before, income matters. That's not something really new, but I think that once again in terms of key driver on the long run, what is your growth and how inclusive is your growth is a key aspect of the story. That's just a new way to say what my grandmother was saying. Yes, she was coming from Russia, and she has this nice sentence that says, you know, when the rich start to starve, the poor are already dead. So income matters a lot in all this food security, and in all aspects, also how you can cope with this. Now, just a few elements that are not discussed right now, because we have one paper on short-term drivers and one paper on long-term drivers, and not so much about the link between the two. That'd be quite important in reality for coupling strategy and why policymakers may want to intervene. And so right now it's poorly covered in the project, and we would like to see some feedback effects. On one hand, it's how price volatility may affect long-term producer choices in terms of investment. So we have here this natural, I would say, at least from an economic point of view, it's relatively easy to implement in a model, but then to calibrate the model, that's another story. At the same time, it was one of the key justifications for price stabilization policy. So is it really working? What is the magnitude of this? I think it's very important. All the evolution of the long-term pattern also affect the short-term vulnerability of the system. If we start to increase production in more volatile region for the policy part or for the weather part, you know, if you start to say, okay, we have no more land in this part of the world, in China and in Europe, and so we need to invest more in Ukraine, but Ukraine is a more risky country on the weather and or policy base, we are increasing the overall vulnerability of the world. So the vulnerability of today depends on the number of exporters, but a lot of things that we can discuss. But also the long-term drivers are going to allocate production, consumption, changing basically your demand elasticity. Okay. The richer we become, the less price elastic we are. So we are moving for a world more and more price inelastic. So basically more price volatile. And we see it already in the few estimations that we can have. And then we have also how short-term FNS consequences can have long-term productivity effects. And in terms now of big figures, it's one of the key drivers. You know. If you start to show that a small crisis have long-term effect on your productivity, on your labor productivity, then economic growth is really hurt. And on all these big simulation models, you start to have big figures. Otherwise, you say policymakers, they can say why we should care about this. You know, these 3, 4, 5, 6% of lost consumption over 2 months, is it really a long-term effect? if you don't have it through health and labor productivity, basically, over 20 years is wasted away. So. And I'm in time, and I'm stopping here. Thank you.
Try to be quite fast. I think we have two, try to, anyhow, record to be okay. We have two excellent scholars presented really fantastic papers in terms of stating the state of the art. And what I like to do and to say, what are the things that they ignored, what needed more weight, and how this type of paper can lead us further. Now, like the case is usually, the papers and the lectures had serial correlation coefficient of 0.3. So, so to some extent, I'm not such a big predictor, so I use the written word. And since I even spoke with them, it was adaptive learning. That makes the presentation much different than the papers. Okay. Now, so first of all, so I try to summarize some of the points and then move forward. First, I think all this theory of the relationship between food and nutrition is useful, and I think that we really develop some notion of food availability, access, and utilization. The notion of vulnerability and resilience are very, very useful. Now, I really think, to be honest, some of these concepts came from old works that I did for FAO, but I really think that we really need to connect all this element of food security to health risk. There is a huge literature on public health. And we really need to connect. One thing that I emphasize is the notion of risk production function. The health risk is something that is produced by several activities. It will be access to food, availability of food, but human health in general. And when you look at strategy, it has to have multidimensional strategy. For example, in some cases you can emphasize it through health intervention. In other cases, the main challenge that you have is how you distribute food to people during a period of crisis. I think all this notion has to be understood better. How we produce risk when it comes to health in crisis is very, very important, and how we can control risk. And I really think that in environment, because people worry about really tiny risks, they develop all this literature of risk generation function. There is all this literature of risk assessment that we can really study a lot in terms of understanding how intervention works. Because price and income intervention are great, but they don't work in crisis. For example, when you have a crisis, do you ship stuff from an airplane or do you develop a soup kitchen? These are little practical problems that are very, very important. How you direct hospitals with respect to nutrition care, or how do you interfere within families? All these issues are very, very important if we really start to understand nutrition intervention. Now, the other things that we have is when we look about health risk, there is incredible element of uncertainty about risk. We operate in a world where we have a lot of variability, and I really think that it really worthwhile to think about three types of intervention: heterogeneity, randomness, and uncertainty. Heterogeneity basically means that different people in different regions have different degree, have different problems. Some people worry about heat, other people worry about frost. So you need different interventions that depend on location. So I think different income groups, different castes, like in India. Heterogeneity in terms of caste is very important. So you need to develop some sort of intervention that deal with it. Randomness is random shocks. Then you can really look at two things, ex ante and ex post, intervention before, intervention after. I really think that as economists we need to speak in this term because the rest of the world develop its own tactics and they ignore us. The only thing that we do is price and income effect, but I think economics has to say much more about other things. And we don't see, and what happened is, and I'll come to it at the end, because we don't really speak with this vocabulary, they really think that we are all these fascists in American term, Republican, and they don't really listen that we really care about humanity. So I really think we have to really to look at some of this notion of risk generation function, etc. And the other thing, then you identify uncertainty. Uncertainty means what you really don't know and you need research. That's number one. The drivers, I think David did a fantastic job about long run and short run, but I really think that there are several drivers that are really important. First, the issue of innovation and regulation. We need to understand innovation. Innovation process is key. It depends on policy and regulation. A lot of time you have this public-private relationship. I don't think that we really understand. I think that the ICABR is a very important link, but how does it work with the private sector? How does it work with the NARS? What is the relationship? Should this CGAR, should the CGAR would only do basic research, or should they engage in an extension? Do they really think about technology transfer? Understanding all these issues of relationship between how innovation works is important. I don't see it really covered. To speak about, let's increase the budget of research by 3%. But so what? How does it work? Will we give them, who will control it? Will it be controlled by NGOs? Will it be scientifically controlled? The productivity of research depends on how it's being managed. I don't think that we speak about it. And the other thing is the issue of regulation. Regulation affects innovation. Generally, we have public and private research, and the private sector is not doing what the public sector is. There is a lot of interdependence. If we have more public, if we have less public public research, there may be less private research because it depends, one depends on the others. Then there is the issue of regulation. If you have excess regulation, the private sector will invest. So if you have excess regulation, you get some incredible ideas, but they will stay in the lab. I think the reason that I think that the CGAIAR has to think about distribution because they never think about regulation. People have this idea that better regulation are better. More caution is great. But if the cost of regulation are such that no one pays attention to it, what good is in the public research? Today, I think that regulation kills public research because no one applies it. And I really think that to some extent, especially when it comes to development, people know about my perspective about GMOs, but I think it's a symptom that today every donor or interest group now is being afraid about something. And when you are rich, you can afford to be afraid of everything. You can have imaginary diseases. But when you are poor and people don't really, and you have a regulatory system that is too difficult, how can you adapt to climate change? You cannot do anything. The other thing is institution. I think that political economy, to me the recent work that Johan Swinnen and others did recently was really the breakthrough. How political economy entered to the system. All the issues of public research, regulation, etc. are political economies. They are not entered to the system, especially in the issue of development. When you really look about how Europe allocate the development money, who is involved? I think the NGO are very important, but do people have the right information when they make the recommendation? Like the example that was brought here before about the fact of biofuel is a good example. Was it a boon or was it a problem? I think we need to know it because generally speaking, a lot of time lack of information is a problem. Another thing is the private sector. I think our biggest problem as economists, we believe in free market, but we ignore the private sector because the donors don't like that. Now, the guys that give money a lot of time made money in the private sector. So when you are in Europe, you have Nestle, and you have and Unilever, and you have all these other companies. They are huge. They have much more impact than the CTIR. But how do we link them? They have incredible impact on nutrition and food security. Supermarket is one issue, but linking private sector behavior and public sector behavior, looking our policy is very important. Now these are research issues that haven't been addressed. And now the private sector is taking over. If you look at Africa, almost all the policies in West Africa for good and bad are driven by the private sector. You have the NGOs, and the NGOs are also knowing it. People speak about certification. This is huge. How good will it be for small or big farmers? I gave you an example of biofuel. I wrote it before I saw the presentation. Biofuel looks like bad, like something bad, but biofuel can be a huge opportunity because it increases demand for agriculture. Rural areas are the most problematic areas in many countries of the world. How can you use biofuel as an opportunity and not a constraint? How do we introduce bioeconomy as an opportunity and as a constraint? How can we introduce climate change as an opportunity, not a constraint? Climate change is a big opportunity. Honestly, from agricultural perspective, I worry about it in the short run, but in the long run, it will allow you to have a new, if you look at adaptation as an opportunity, and climate change will allow you to do it, let's do research about how adaptation to climate change can be done in a way that will be deal with the issues of nutrition well, rather than how to say, okay, let's not think about adaptation, because if you don't think about it, because if we do adaptation, we don't do prevention. We don't do prevention of climate change. No, everyone knows about it in this world. So I think to look at climate change and technology in a more open way, and to look at biofuel in a more open way is a big challenge. Okay. Now, I hope people didn't lose me completely. Anyhow, now the other thing is the issue of CGE and nutrition and food security. Now, CGE is an incredibly important tool. And I really think that what is done here is really great. And I think especially the work that David mentioned and how you can introduce CGE in issues of nutrition is very important. But I really think that one of the key elements, because here you really have the people that do a lot of the frontier work of CGE, is to think how to make CGE a better tool, a more reliable tool, a more acceptable tool. So for example, you start speaking about models speaking to one another. This is a great direction. It may be worthwhile to increase the list of models considered. Actually, we did a similar exercise in the area of biofuel. To see how we take all this mathematical programming model and bring them together. How do you integrate CGE to GIS? We start actually thinking about it. Thinking about really using all this computer-based modeling that can derive insight to policies and linking together taking advantage of information technology. That to me can be one challenge of this group. Now, I think that today what happened in economic, in my view, is very interesting. You have a bunch of people that believe that if they do a little bit of income impact assessment using simple statistics, and they can solve the problem of the world. Then I don't believe that it's very useful, it's essential, it's important, but doing experiment by itself is only is part of the problem, a small part of the problem. A lot of time, you need the simulation because they allow policymakers to really try to see what are all the opportunities that they have. Now, CGE has two challenges. First of all the time to update itself, taking advantage of the fact that there are many tools and computers can integrate stuff, and also realizing that one model cannot do anything. And secondly, to try to develop literature about the methodologies so that the rest of the world will realize that it's something that is not mechanical. I think that this is one challenge of this model. Okay. So, as aspect of CGE that need to be addressed, and addressing risk and uncertainties, things that we mentioned, dynamic, another thing, we spoke about supermarket, non-competitive behavior. How non-competitive behavior enters there? And adoption. These are two elements that are missing. Adoption and non-competitive behavior. To me, having some small improvement in how you introduce adoption and non-competitive behavior to CGE can be great. Now, so the key thing is that when we look about the future, we have to recognize that we have new realities and we need to address them. When we look about a project, what really worries me is that this project will be more about the past than the future. We have new realities, the internet, the computer revolution, precision farming, drip, biotech, bioeconomy, all this stuff can change the way people farm in Africa and everywhere. The new industrial organization of supply chains, consumerism. How can the poor benefit from the preferences of the rich? As a reality change, you have to think about research topics that look at the new reality rather than reality of the time. New financial innovation. Do they exist? How can finance? To me, that's one area that we really don't know a lot, and it's really important. Everyone knows that there is some element that we really think about microfinance. But how does microfinance relate to macrofinance? How you can build a dealership? How can Cadre now build several $1 billion of facilities in West Africa? They are very useful facilities. How did they finance it? How can an organization in the West work in small farmers? To me, the link between big finance and small farmers is totally unexplored. These are really big issues. There are a lot of emerging constraints. I'm much more worried about fertilizer than climate. Not that I don't worry about climate, because climate will be 10 or 15 years from now and everyone worries about it. But fertilizer is a big, big issue, especially when it comes to KNP. How can we do it? That's the issue where farmers in Africa will suffer, because if the price of potash becomes very high, it will be available to the poor. And you really need it in tropical soil. The issues of population. How do you deal with aging? How do you deal with migration? So my feeling is that there are several areas that really need a research agenda that can be really both theoretical and empirical. Like, for example, all the issues of nutrition, how to take advantage of climate change and biofuel rather than looking at it as a constraint. Political economy, the issue of value chain. I think the issue is the upgrading of scientific knowledge, method, how to take advantage of them. Now, there is another thing that is very, very important, and I think this can help. Policymakers and NGOs are generally, all the time, in my views, fighting the wars of the past. Why? Because think about it. Students that take my class today on about ag policy will be a policymaker 15 years from now. I don't think that he will study this topic ever in the future. Today, I hear people come with ideas that were wrong, that were wrong in 2000 because they learned it in 1990. How we can develop, how we take it to make people informed about what's going on now. How to make people informed that what happened with biofuel wasn't a complete tragedy. There were problems, but there were a lot of opportunities. How can we make people to learn that actually people in India think that GMO, I know, the GMO has been a success. I really think that today we have a huge issue of communication with policymakers, especially in Europe, also in the US. In my university, most of the scientists basically really think that the solution for all of agricultural problems in the world is basically farmer gardens. Seriously. Today, they would like to put, so I think this is a huge challenge that is something that we have to come. We have new knowledge, we think about new mechanisms, there are new opportunities. I think that we have to think about it, but we also have to communicate about it. Now, the thing is that this project starts, and it is important to investigate how to improve the frontier of knowledge. I spoke with Johan, and that's what I do. When I get money, I always ask myself, how do I produce the best knowledge I can? It doesn't matter what I told it's better what I told the donor, but a lot of time, I know that they won't judge me about mission accomplished. They would tell me if there was a breakthrough that come out of it, if there was something that make a difference. And I would be much more proud. Say, okay, I came with this and I produce a paper in science and people think. So to me, this is a time that you have to say, okay, we promised all this stuff, it was done. How we can really develop a mechanism that would result in the best possible science. To me, that's a challenge. And I'm sure that you can do it. You have a great foundation and a great team, so this assessment can help to make things better. Thanks.
Can you review because we have some discussion? Okay. We have three very excellent presentations because I will count David's comment another presentation. We have a bit of time for discussion, so let's open it up. Who would like to have a comment or question? No comments? Yes, please. Can we have a comment for you? There it is.
Okay, thank you for my presentation. I'm Lucia from the European Commission. My question basically goes to the immediate presenters. I'm sorry for not pronouncing your name. You indicated that the 4 pillars of food securities as food security status and stability. And under stability you have vulnerability and resilience. Now, since vulnerable households are less resilient, and if it is more resilient, it's less vulnerable, it seems to me that it is vulnerability the other side of the coin for resilience. And sometimes when we define resilience also, resilient household or community should go beyond the previous status, since usually we are measuring resilience after shock, after the occurrence of the shock, and households or the community can go beyond that. So that the question is, it is very easy to quantify vulnerability using that calorie intake and so forth, but how are we able to quantify or able to measure the resilience status of the households? I'm saying this one, these days resilience become more of a fashion thing. In every project and other aspect, people are saying, resilient, but you couldn't find anything that will to measure it. And the second point is a kind of comment. I'm really happy to hear that high food prices are benefiting at least small rural farming households, as David and other indicators are showing this one. For one of the paper that I found actually in my work, although Ethiopia is the poorest country who rely on food aid, what we found is that high food prices are really benefiting the rural households, as input price and other things are also going to be increasing. I'm not going to say my work, however, I'm really happy that high prices are also benefiting the rural households too. Thank you very much.
Any other comments, issues? Yes, please.
Yes, hi, my name is Mark Undergard from Prospects. I have to say that I'm really happy with the 3 presentations, and I think already what you mentioned, Mr. Zilberman, the will to go further, with the will to identify factors, new factors, long-term factors that will play on food and nutrition security. And I just would like to make aware, and perhaps also good for the rest of the consortium, that we have other processes that might add to your search and that might actually give interesting input and try out some of those findings that you have. We have a stakeholder process that develops scenarios so we're talking there about the uncertainty factor, and we have also included in the scenario, the stakeholder package, a process that will actually check on policy options and work those through. So I would think that from what I heard right now, there might be much more of a potential for collaboration on that, going towards the new frontiers that you're talking about with the stakeholders, because they can bring in some of the out-of-the-box thinking that even with the best wishes, you might not find in the existing models. But again, I think it's absolutely excellent that you're looking that far for going for the next frontiers. Thank you.
Any other questions? All right. If there are no questions, maybe I'll just add a couple of comments that I picked up through the presentations. I was very impressed, Yo, when you said that your major conclusion is the system is very complex, and then we heard David, of course, who made it even more complex. So it all became, and I think out of all this complexity, somehow we ought to be identifying some key questions or some key issues for analysis. Otherwise, with so much complexity, how can we move forward? One of the points you made, David, is that the short term can give some clues about the long term, in fact, can condition the long term, and vice versa. The situation today, which is a result of long-term processes, can give. These are two separate but well-identifiable questions which I think could provide some clues. But anyway, out of all this complexity and all these different factors that weigh them, certainly that have been identified, and certainly the project cannot take care of everything, can you identify 2 or 3 or 4, or some of the more important ones that have been under-researched perhaps, that really need to be researched and to have some contribution? Anyway, that's just a comment and some question. Any other issues or questions? Yes, please, Yoki. Mike, please. There. Everybody's coming.
Yes, these were great presentations. David, you said innovation process depends on policies and regulations, and then came out rather hard on we have a situation of over-regulation, and I agree with that. But I also see an opposite trend, that we have lots of new incentive mechanisms coming about to facilitate innovation. What role do new incentive mechanisms, prices for breakthroughs, the movement for results-based development aid, which essentially is giving a price to innovation in achieving a certain result. How skeptical are you about that? And what's the balance?
Okay, I was told that we can go into our lunchtime a little bit, so this is interesting enough so that we can. But let me give you 1 or 2 minutes to each one of the presenters to react. So let's start with you, David, first.
Thank you.
This is David, this is David.
On the less important is the more important.
Now, so I think that the main point is about this fact that we are dealing with. On one point, on one side, I think we all agree that we are dealing here with a very complex and rich topics. On one hand, we have already all the questions of the past that are poorly solved, I would say. And then David has brought all the questions of the future that we should address if we don't want to be too late to provide information for policymakers. Of course, we can have a 20 years Foodsecure project, and that's the goal of hence. But no, I think that right now, yes, in terms of research question, obviously, from my perspective, that is about large-scale model, is first to bring more heterogeneity within this large-scale model. About technology, about household, because the devil, or God, it depends how you look at things, is in the detail. And this one-size-fits-all approach will not work. So really, more heterogeneity into this large-scale model is important. And the next question is really the short-term versus long-term question, because in many cases we have dynamic model, but if the dynamic model follows some kind of very smooth trend because they are basically independent from the path they take, we don't need to have a dynamic model. Okay? a very static model can give you a long-term solution. If you want a dynamic model, it means that stories should matter. And we don't have it yet. And the only way to get it is to link short-term fluctuation to long-term trend. So that the two pillars I want to develop to push the frontier of research. Okay.
Yo, do you have any comments? Actually, I would like to refer the first question we had about resilience point to you, because you've done empirical work on that. What have we done? You want to say something based on your work on vulnerability and resilience? I mean, you've done some of the measurement of that as well.
I would perhaps, there's no time right now, maybe we can mention it later.
So I mean, I'd like to see the Ethiopia study in any case. I mean, how we find these things. Microphone, please. Okay. So I was just saying that Aleko is actually, I mean, the paper we refer to some of his work on vulnerability and on resilience, where he has empirically tried to, I mean, he has defined it in one of his papers, and he's also tried to measure it. Okay. And so it's in great detail how they go through it. In terms of the rest, you know, I think what comes up in this discussion now, and what David brought out and what was just emphasized, this is something which is very important for the management of this project. Okay, to what extent we can go beyond what we've written down, say, and basically and allow for new things that come up in the course of this project, and basically reallocate some of the funding time towards this type of issue that I think is important. In terms of the key areas, what Aleko has said, you know, I tried to do a bit of that in my second part of my presentation. I think you can identify importance from, ultimately as practice, you have to use that, I think, from a pragmatic perspective. You can't do everything just in terms of time, basically how complex everything is. So you've got to focus on some issues, right? And so the issues then, they can be important from a policy perspective, from a scientific perspective, from the impact on people's lives. And policy and impact is not necessarily the same, because if you think from the EU perspective, right, what are their big policy discussions? I mean, it's certainly been agricultural policy, where they essentially discussed for 4 years, or 5 years, and essentially came to, you can say not much, okay? But in any case, well, they decided to keep it more or less what it was. But that's a really big thing at the European policy level, okay? And the issue is, to what extent is that going to affect, basically, farmers' lives and food security of poor households? And for that perspective, okay, I always come back to this, what's the right price of food? But it was a tremendously important factor in the whole, I mean, the reason why the EU has gone through 25 years of policy reform, that was a really important factor linked to WTO, okay? But the implicit argument behind that was all the model runs, which were showing that it was basically hurting poor farmers in developing countries. So, high prices were good for the farmers. That's the model, that's why the cap was reformed, to put it very, very simply. I think then also on the, if you look more on the scientific, on the impact effect, I really do, and this is just, of course I'm biased in these things because I don't do these big model runs, etc. But I do think that the value chain issue is really important for, and increasingly important for developing countries. If you just look at how the structure of their export has changed over the past 20 years, it's tremendous. 20 years ago, 25 years ago, most of the exports, about 40–50%, were traditional exports like coffee, tea, cotton, and that was all the milk commodities, right? I mean, that's totally changed now. I think about half of it is now what we would call high value, and that's a tremendous implication. And then there's the supermarketization of these countries. In addition to that, the domestic modernization is adding to all that. And as I said, I think in terms of its, in reality, it turns out to be a big mechanism in terms of transferring fertilizer technology know-how to do to poor, and it seems to be doing, I think, better than a lot of public initiatives.
There's two or three basic questions. I think the first thing is, I agree that when you have a project like this, the more you think about how to refine it would be great, and the stakeholder process is great. But I wish that people also would speak with some of the private sector that is involving a lot of the agricultural issues and development rather than only with NGO and policymakers. Because I think the process today is biased towards one direction, and some of the big companies are also involved. So I think it's really important to get them involved. In terms of where to go, I don't think that you need a drastic change, but I think we need to identify what are the areas that you really are unique or have relative advantage. So I think I found 3 or 4 areas. All the issues of nutrition and the impact of nutrition, what affect nutrition, what improve nutrition intervention, the nutrition, improving how food policies affect nutrition. I think one issue that people spoke about the issues of nutrition education. If you don't do it, not many other things including the economic profession. So this is one area. The other area I think is, like I think David started doing it, to see when you look at climate, all the use of CGE, to look at it from a methodological perspective. Not only we use this number, but what does it all mean? How does it fit the policy? How does it do work that other methods don't do? So then it becomes, that would reduce a lot of that argument. Now, I agree that the value chain is really, really important. Understanding the value chain is incredibly important. I think you cannot really do anything along the line. And the other thing is the issue of extreme events. I think that there is a tendency to change all our perception when you have extreme events, but when it comes to food, it's not always. And finally, like political economy is a great topic. You can mention it, but other people can do it as well. Finally, to start to see how the results that you are producing can change the perceived notion. It's not a tough exercise to see what do people think about food and environment and how it can affect things. I forgot one thing that to me is really important, all this issue of regulation and technology. Because to me, what the EU is doing now, more than anything else, is affecting the debate. Now I come to the point that Joachim brought about the issues of incentive to deal with innovation. My feeling is that it's nice to have incentive to enhance innovation. Today the problem is not so much about about innovation as what as moving from innovation to application. And this is the area where regulation is the problem. I think developing competition, developing price may enhance the problem. But understanding the innovation process and see how you move from the individual innovator to the big company or the big country or the big organization, how you commercialize it, that's something that we don't know. A lot of time we develop all these prizes and they can be very useful, but I really feel that they really don't really look at this gap. So to me it's nice to look about invention to innovation. It may be, for example, much more useful to think how the NARS can work better and take innovation and move it forward, or how you can really get the private sector involved better than to think only about what you do for research. I think that on one hand we have to establish the importance of support of agricultural research, and I think this is a big challenge. But I think we also have to say what happens when we go downstream. I think this is where we have a lot of problems to do.
Okay, great, thank you very much. I guess you will agree with me this was a very productive and rich session, so let's acknowledge our speakers.